Every grand scheme to reorganize society begins with the same fatal assumption, that someone, somewhere, possesses the knowledge necessary to coordinate millions of individual decisions better than those individuals themselves. This assumption has led to some of the most devastating economic failures in human history, yet it persists with remarkable tenacity. The planners who designed the Soviet economy believed they could calculate optimal production better than markets. The architects of wartime controls thought they could allocate resources more efficiently than price signals. Time and again, reality has shattered these illusions. What these planners failed to grasp is what I discovered through decades of studying how societies actually coordinate their activities: the knowledge problem. Today, I'll reveal why this problem makes central planning not merely difficult, but logically impossible. You'll discover why the most sophisticated computer models and brilliant minds cannot replicate what spontaneous order achieves effortlessly every day. The stakes couldn't be higher. Understanding this fatal flaw is essential for preserving the foundations of prosperity and freedom. Chapter 1: The Illusion of Omniscient Planning. The central planner's dream appears deceptively simple: gather all relevant information, calculate optimal outcomes, and issue directives that maximize social welfare. This vision has captivated brilliant minds from Saint Simon to modern technocrats who believe artificial intelligence can finally solve the coordination problem. Yet this dream rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of knowledge itself. During my years observing wartime economic controls, I witnessed firsthand how even the most dedicated and intelligent planners struggled with information that was simultaneously vast and ephemeral. They collected statistics on production capacity, resource availability, and consumer preferences, believing these data points could capture the full complexity of economic reality. What they failed to recognize was that the most crucial knowledge for economic coordination exists not in statistical aggregates, but in the fleeting circumstances of time and place. Consider the knowledge possessed by a farmer about soil conditions in his specific field, or a shopkeeper's understanding of her customers' changing preferences, or an entrepreneur's insight into an emerging market opportunity. This practical knowledge cannot be communicated to central authorities without losing its essential characteristics. It is knowledge that exists only in context, embedded in local circumstances, and constantly changing as conditions evolve. The planner's fallacy lies in confusing two fundamentally different types of knowledge: scientific knowledge that can be articulated and transmitted, and practical knowledge that emerges from direct experience with particular circumstances. Scientific knowledge follows universal principles. The laws of physics apply equally in New York and Tokyo. But practical knowledge is irreducibly local and personal. The knowledge needed to coordinate economic activity belongs overwhelmingly to this second category. When planners attempt to centralize decision-making, they inevitably discard precisely the information most crucial for efficient coordination. They transform living, contextual knowledge into dead statistical abstractions. This isn't a technical problem that better computers can solve, it's a logical impossibility rooted in the nature of knowledge itself. No amount of processing power can substitute for the distributed intelligence of millions of individuals responding to their immediate circumstances. Chapter 2: The Knowledge That Cannot Be Centralized. To understand why central planning fails, we must distinguish between knowledge that can be centralized and knowledge that cannot. The planner's error stems from assuming all relevant knowledge belongs to the first category, when in fact the most crucial information for economic coordination falls into the second. Centralizable knowledge consists of general principles, scientific laws, and codified information that can be written down, transmitted, and applied universally. The techniques for steel production, principles of accounting, or laws of thermodynamics fall into this category. This knowledge forms the foundation of technical expertise and professional training. But economic coordination depends primarily on knowledge that resists centralization, the particular circumstances of time and place that I identified as the core of the coordination problem. This knowledge includes awareness of local supply disruptions, understanding of customer preferences in specific neighborhoods, recognition of emerging opportunities before they become obvious to others, and countless other details that exist only in the minds of those directly involved in particular situations. During my observations of market processes, I realized that successful coordination requires not just technical knowledge about production methods, but intimate familiarity with constantly changing local conditions. The entrepreneur who notices that his customers are asking for a product not currently available possesses knowledge that cannot be communicated effectively to distant planners. By the time he reports this information through bureaucratic channels, the opportunity may have vanished or been captured by more responsive competitors. This practical knowledge has several crucial characteristics that make centralization impossible. First, it is often tacit. The knowledge holder cannot fully articulate what he knows. Second, it is contextual. Its value depends entirely on specific circumstances that cannot be replicated elsewhere. Third, it is temporal. It becomes obsolete as circumstances change, often within hours or days. Fourth, it is personal. It exists only in the minds of individuals who have gained it through direct experience. The price system serves as humanity's most sophisticated method for utilizing this distributed knowledge without centralizing it. When the farmer notices soil conditions that will reduce his crop yield, he doesn't need to explain these conditions to anyone. He simply adjusts his production plans, and the resulting changes in supply and demand automatically signal to others throughout the economy that adjustments are needed. The beauty of this system lies in its ability to coordinate millions of decisions without requiring anyone to possess comprehensive knowledge of the whole. Central planners, no matter how intelligent or well-intentioned, cannot access this distributed knowledge without destroying its essential characteristics. The very act of centralization transforms living, contextual knowledge into dead information that has lost its capacity to guide efficient action. Chapter 3: The Price System as a Knowledge Discovery Mechanism. While central planners struggle with the impossible task of gathering and processing all relevant information, the price system accomplishes something far more sophisticated. It enables coordination without centralization. Prices function as a vast communication network that signals changes in conditions throughout the economy without requiring anyone to understand the complete picture. Consider what happens when a new deposit of copper is discovered in Chile, or when a drought threatens wheat crops in Kansas, or when consumers develop a preference for electric vehicles. In a centrally planned system, this information would need to travel up bureaucratic hierarchies, be processed by planning authorities, and then be translated into new directives sent back down to producers and consumers. By the time these adjustments occur, the original conditions may have changed again. In contrast, the price system responds to these changes almost instantaneously. The copper discovery leads to increased supply and lower copper prices, automatically signaling to manufacturers that copper-intensive products have become more economical to produce. The wheat drought causes price increases that simultaneously encourage conservation by consumers and increased production by farmers in unaffected regions. The shift toward electric vehicles changes relative prices throughout the automotive supply chain, guiding resources toward battery technology and away from internal combustion engines. Here's what makes this process remarkable: none of the millions of participants needs to understand why prices are changing. The consumer who switches to aluminum products because copper prices have risen doesn't need to know about mining conditions in Chile. The farmer who plants more wheat because of higher prices doesn't need to understand weather patterns in distant regions. Each person responds to price signals that capture and communicate the essential information they need for their decisions. Take a moment to observe how prices in your daily life reflect scarcity and abundance. Notice how seasonal price changes guide your consumption choices, or how gas prices influence your driving decisions. You're witnessing the operation of humanity's most sophisticated information system. This discovery function of prices cannot be replicated by central planning because it depends on the decentralized responses of millions of individuals to their particular circumstances. Prices don't just reflect existing conditions, they actively discover information that didn't previously exist. When an entrepreneur experiments with a new product and consumers respond positively, the resulting profits signal that resources should flow toward this innovation. This is knowledge creation, not just information processing. The planner's fatal flaw lies in treating prices as mere accounting devices that could be computed by rational calculation. They failed to understand that prices emerge from human action, not human design, and that their information content depends on the freedom of individuals to respond to changing circumstances according to their own knowledge and judgment. Chapter 4: The Arrogance of Reason and the Scientific Fallacy. The persistence of central planning despite its repeated failures reveals something deeper than mere intellectual error. It reflects what I've termed the fatal conceit of believing that human reason can design institutions superior to those that have evolved through centuries of trial and error. This arrogance manifests most clearly in the scientific fallacy, the misguided attempt to apply the methods of natural science to the coordination of human society. In the natural sciences, controlled experiments and mathematical modeling have achieved spectacular successes. Scientists can predict planetary motions, design efficient engines, and manipulate matter at the atomic level because they deal with phenomena governed by universal laws that remain constant across time and space. The success of these methods naturally leads to the tempting belief that similar approaches can solve social and economic problems. But this analogy breaks down completely when applied to human action. Unlike planets or atoms, human beings possess consciousness, make choices based on subjective valuations, and constantly adapt their behavior in response to changing circumstances. The knowledge required for social coordination is not like the knowledge of physics. It cannot be discovered through laboratory experiments or expressed in mathematical equations that hold universally. During my decades of academic work, I witnessed how this scientific approach infected economic thinking. Brilliant scholars attempted to reduce human choice to mathematical functions, believing they could predict aggregate economic behavior with the same precision that engineers predict bridge stress. They collected vast amounts of statistical data, constructed elaborate mathematical models, and convinced themselves that economic planning could become as scientific as engineering. This approach fundamentally misunderstands both the nature of science and the nature of human society. True science recognizes the limits of its methods and confines itself to phenomena that can be subjected to controlled experimentation. The scientific economist, by contrast, applies scientific-sounding methods to phenomena that cannot be isolated from their human context, producing an illusion of precision that masks fundamental ignorance. The central planner's confidence stems from this scientific delusion. He believes that economics is simply a more complex form of engineering, a technical problem that can be solved through better data collection and more sophisticated analysis. He fails to recognize that social coordination involves not just technical calculations but the mobilization of dispersed knowledge that exists only in the minds of millions of individuals. This intellectual arrogance becomes dangerous when it guides policy. The planner who believes he can calculate optimal outcomes dismisses the evolved institutions that actually coordinate social activity. He replaces price signals with bureaucratic directives, contractual freedom with regulatory commands, and spontaneous order with imposed design. The inevitable failures are attributed to insufficient data or inadequate computing power, never to the fundamental impossibility of the enterprise itself. The scientific fallacy continues to plague contemporary policy debates, where complex social problems are treated as technical challenges requiring expert solutions rather than evolved institutional responses. Chapter 5: How Effective Institutions Emerge Without Design. The most effective institutions that coordinate human behavior, language, money, common law, and market prices share a remarkable characteristic: none were designed by human intelligence, yet all display an elegant functionality that exceeds anything deliberate planning has achieved. This paradox reveals a fundamental truth about social coordination that central planners consistently fail to grasp. Consider the English language you're hearing now. No committee designed its grammar. No authority determined its vocabulary. No plan established its rules of pronunciation. Yet it enables precise communication among hundreds of millions of speakers and continues to evolve in response to changing needs. Technical terms emerge organically as new technologies develop. Slang expressions capture social phenomena that formal language cannot express, and grammatical structures adapt to facilitate clearer communication. The evolution of language demonstrates how complex order emerges through countless individual contributions without central direction. Each speaker contributes to linguistic development by adopting useful innovations and abandoning clumsy expressions. Successful linguistic innovations spread through voluntary adoption, while unsuccessful ones disappear through disuse. This evolutionary process produces a communication system far more sophisticated and adaptive than any designed language could achieve. The same evolutionary logic explains the emergence of money. No government decreed that gold should serve as a medium of exchange, yet societies throughout history independently converged on precious metals as monetary standards. Money emerged because it solved a fundamental coordination problem: the double coincidence of wants that makes barter inefficient. Those societies that developed effective monetary institutions gained tremendous advantages in trade and economic development, while those that relied on primitive exchange systems remained economically stagnant. Common law represents another triumph of evolutionary institutional development. Rather than being imposed by legislative decree, legal principles emerged through the gradual accumulation of judicial decisions responding to particular disputes. Judges confronted with novel situations drew upon established precedents while adapting legal rules to new circumstances. Successful legal innovations were retained and extended to similar cases, while dysfunctional rules were gradually abandoned. Take a moment to observe how institutions in your daily life have evolved to solve coordination problems. Notice how business practices, social customs, and informal rules have developed to facilitate cooperation without anyone designing them. This evolutionary process produces institutions with several crucial advantages over designed alternatives. First, they incorporate information from countless individual experiences rather than relying on the limited knowledge of planners. Second, they adapt continuously to changing circumstances rather than requiring periodic redesign. Third, they coordinate behavior through voluntary compliance rather than coercive enforcement. Fourth, they emerge from actual human needs rather than theoretical ideals. The central planner's fatal error lies in believing that rational design can improve upon evolutionary processes. He observes the apparent inefficiencies and inequities of evolved institutions and assumes that deliberate reform can produce superior outcomes. What he fails to recognize is that these institutions embody accumulated wisdom about human coordination that no individual mind can fully comprehend. Modern examples of evolutionary institutional development include the Internet protocols that enable global communication, the practices that have emerged in cryptocurrency markets, and the informal rules that govern social media interactions. These developments demonstrate that institutional evolution continues whenever people are free to experiment with new forms of cooperation. Chapter 6: The Constitutional Framework for Spontaneous Order. The relationship between spontaneous order and individual liberty runs deeper than mere correlation. It reflects a fundamental logical connection that I explored throughout my constitutional writings. Spontaneous order cannot emerge without the secure protection of individual freedom, while individual freedom requires the institutional framework that only spontaneous order can provide. Understanding this connection is essential for grasping why central planning inevitably destroys both economic efficiency and political liberty. Spontaneous order depends on individuals being free to respond to their particular circumstances according to their own knowledge and judgment. When a farmer notices soil conditions that require different planting techniques, or when an entrepreneur recognizes an unmet market need, or when a consumer discovers a preference for new products, the efficiency of overall coordination depends on their freedom to act on this knowledge. Any system that restricts these responses, whether through price controls, production quotas, or regulatory barriers, diminishes the system's capacity to utilize dispersed information. This is why economic liberty and political liberty prove inseparable in practice. The knowledge that guides economic coordination includes not just technical information about production methods, but judgments about value, assessments of risk, and predictions about future preferences. These judgments cannot be separated from the fundamental human capacity for independent thought and choice. When government assumes the authority to override individual economic decisions, it necessarily assumes the authority to substitute official judgments for private ones. The protection of individual liberty requires constitutional limits on governmental power that go far beyond traditional civil liberties. It requires what I termed the rule of law, a framework of general, abstract rules that apply equally to all individuals rather than specific commands directed at particular persons or groups. Under the rule of law, individuals can predict the legal consequences of their actions and plan accordingly, enabling the long-term coordination that complex economies require. Consider how the American constitutional tradition embodies many of these principles. The separation of powers prevents any single authority from accumulating the comprehensive control that central planning requires. Federalism allows different jurisdictions to experiment with different approaches, enabling institutional evolution through competitive selection. The protection of private property and contractual freedom creates the foundation for market coordination. These constitutional features were not designed primarily as economic policies, yet they create precisely the institutional environment that spontaneous order requires. The rule of law differs fundamentally from rule by law, which merely means that government acts through legal instruments. True rule of law constrains governmental power by requiring that legal rules meet certain formal characteristics. They must be general rather than particular, prospective rather than retroactive, and equally applicable to rulers and ruled alike. These constraints prevent government from engaging in the detailed economic management that central planning requires. When government violates these constitutional principles, whether through regulatory micromanagement, selective enforcement, or special privileges for favored groups, it undermines the institutional foundation that spontaneous order requires. Each intervention creates distortions that generate demands for further interventions, leading toward the comprehensive control that characterizes central planning. The tragedy of modern democratic societies lies in their tendency to expand governmental power beyond constitutional limits in response to immediate problems, without recognizing how these expansions erode the institutional foundation of their own prosperity. The administrative state that has grown up around democratic institutions represents a form of soft central planning that achieves many of the same destructive effects as its totalitarian counterparts, albeit through gradual encroachment rather than revolutionary transformation. Protecting spontaneous order requires constant vigilance about constitutional boundaries and principled resistance to the expansion of governmental power beyond its proper limits. Chapter 7: Contemporary Applications and Digital Spontaneous Order. The principles I developed decades ago to explain the failures of central planning have gained new relevance in our digital age, where we witness both unprecedented examples of spontaneous order and new attempts at centralized control. The emergence of the Internet, cryptocurrency markets, and digital platforms demonstrates that spontaneous order continues to evolve and adapt to technological change, while government attempts to regulate these phenomena reveal the persistence of the central planner's fatal conceit. Consider how the Internet itself exemplifies spontaneous order. No central authority designed the protocols that enable global digital communication, yet these standards emerged through voluntary adoption and evolutionary refinement. The TCP/IP protocol that underlies Internet communication was not imposed by government decree but adopted because it solved coordination problems more effectively than competing alternatives. The World Wide Web emerged from the work of individual innovators who created tools that others found useful and began adopting voluntarily. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies represent perhaps the most striking contemporary example of institutional evolution through spontaneous order. Satoshi Nakamoto solved the double spending problem that had long plagued digital currencies not through central authority but through a decentralized consensus mechanism that enables coordination without control. The entire cryptocurrency ecosystem has evolved through voluntary experimentation, with successful innovations spreading through adoption while failed experiments disappear through market selection. These digital phenomena demonstrate that the knowledge problem I identified remains as relevant as ever. The programmers who contribute to open-source projects possess detailed knowledge about specific technical challenges that no central coordinator could possess. The traders who participate in cryptocurrency markets have access to information about market conditions that changes too rapidly for central planning to process. The users who adopt digital platforms make decisions based on their particular circumstances and preferences that cannot be anticipated by platform designers. Yet we also see contemporary examples of the central planning mentality applied to digital markets. Proposals for central bank digital currencies represent attempts to recreate the control over monetary systems that governments lost with the emergence of cryptocurrencies. Comprehensive data privacy regulations often reflect the belief that bureaucrats can determine optimal privacy practices better than the voluntary agreements between users and platforms. Antitrust enforcement increasingly targets successful platforms not for harming consumers but for achieving the coordination that spontaneous order naturally produces. The policy implications of spontaneous order theory for contemporary America are profound. Rather than attempting to manage digital markets through comprehensive regulation, policymakers should focus on maintaining the institutional framework that enables evolutionary development. This means protecting property rights in digital assets, maintaining competitive markets through the elimination of barriers to entry rather than the punishment of success, and resisting the temptation to substitute regulatory commands for market coordination. In healthcare, education, and financial services, the principles of spontaneous order suggest that decentralized experimentation will discover solutions that no central planner could devise. The challenge lies in creating constitutional and legal frameworks that protect the freedom to experiment while preventing the accumulation of power that stifles innovation. The digital economy demonstrates that human creativity and voluntary cooperation continue to solve coordination problems that defeat central planning. The task for those who understand these principles is to protect the institutional conditions that enable this evolutionary process to continue. Conclusion. The fatal flaw I discovered in central planning runs deeper than technical difficulties or insufficient information. It reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of knowledge itself and the impossibility of centralizing the dispersed wisdom that spontaneous coordination requires. Every attempt to impose rational design upon the evolved institutions that actually coordinate human behavior destroys precisely the knowledge that makes coordination possible. This insight carries urgent relevance for contemporary policy debates where the central planner's conceit continues to manifest in new forms. Whether in digital regulation, healthcare reform, or monetary policy, the temptation persists to believe that expert knowledge can substitute for the distributed intelligence of voluntary cooperation. The historical record demonstrates the futility of this belief, yet each generation seems destined to rediscover these lessons through costly experience. The path forward requires intellectual humility about the limits of human knowledge and constitutional vigilance about the bounds of governmental power. We must resist the fatal conceit that rational design can improve upon evolutionary processes, while maintaining the institutional framework that enables spontaneous order to flourish. The prosperity and freedom that previous generations bequeathed to us depend upon understanding and preserving these principles. The elegance of spontaneous order lies not in its perfection, but in its capacity for continuous adaptation and improvement through the voluntary cooperation of free individuals responding to their particular circumstances with their irreplaceable local knowledge.